Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Robert Gerwarth, and we're going to discuss a topic that came to my mind when we had Chris Temshel on a live stream a few months back on our YouTube channel. And we discussed, did World War One really end in 1918 with the peace treaty of Versailles on the 11th hour? And we kind of found out that no, it didn't really end in 1918 at the 11th hour, because we're going to give some reasoning in this episode, and that's why I wanted to make this episode, because I think it's a fascinating discussion. Because a common conception is that the 11th hour was the final hour when the World War One ended, but as you may learn in this episode, that's not necessarily the case. So, what is your take on this? And we're going to get into more details, of course, but what do you think about the idea that the war ended in 1918 at the 11th hour?
Well, the idea that the First World War ended neatly in November 1918 is in some ways a very sort of Western European one.
Mm,
So I often refer to this idea as a kind of Western Front interpretation of the First World War,
yeah,
where you have the kind of notion that the conflict starts quite neatly in August 1914 and ends in November 1918.
yeah,
But the thing is, that's not true for all the different combatant nations, particularly
mm,
those in Central and Eastern Europe, but also for Ireland, where I live these days, where, of
mm,
course, the First World War is followed by a
mm.
National War of Independence, and
The
then
Irish Civil War, yeah.
that's right, and then the Irish Civil War, right? So, um, in some parts of Europe, the war pretty much continues unabated, but in different forms. So, what you have instead of larger state armies kind of clashing on the battlefields, you have lots of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary insurgencies. You have civil wars, but you also have more traditional wars fighting where different sides are fighting over borders, which are
Mm,
uh, up in the air because many of the European land empires have collapsed. And now the question is, what are the borders of
mm,
those emerging nation states in Central and Eastern Europe, but also, of course, in Anatolia after the collapse of the Ottoman
mm,
Empire?
mm,
So in the years immediately after 1918, and one can only estimate that because no one really takes count, but some people would say that roughly 5 million people die in
mm.
those 5 years. So
That's almost equal of the Great War itself in numbers, isn't it?
it is, yeah. I mean, you have basically combatants and non-combatants as well as civilians dying in that period, but you also have war-induced famine. You have all sorts of diseases that are triggered by these chaotic circumstances. So people die of different causes, but there's most certainly ongoing violence at a fairly epic scale. And what characterizes that violence is that the number of civilians is relatively high. It's higher than it was during the First World War, the number of civilians killed. So that I think is not only interesting in terms of periodization, when did the First World War end, but also in terms of the changing nature of violence. In other words, whereas in the First World War you have kind of standing armies or conscript armies fighting each other, you suddenly have these kind of paramilitary organizations in the absence of state armies that are fighting out amongst themselves who is going to become the national army of the emerging state. So it's a very chaotic period, but it's certainly
Mm,
not one that I would associate with peace.
mm. So I want to begin at the Treaty of Versailles, and this what would lead up to the 11th hour. So let's talk about the famous when signing of Versailles and what that would contain, and as well the final hours of the main war going on, ending on the battlefront, like you said, with standing armies.
Um, so initially, let's go back a little bit to the Armistice of Compiègne, which is signed by the German delegation. So the situation is quite complex in the sense that up until the beginning of the year 1918, and particularly after Russia leaves the First World War as a result of the Bolshevik
Mm,
Revolution, the Germans think they're going to win this, right?
mm,
They
And the
have
United States hasn't entered yet, so that makes a lot of sense
That's
at the
right. I mean,
time.
they have in terms of, obviously Britain and France are hugely indebted to the United States in
Yeah,
financial terms because they're their main creditor. Um, but what happens is that once Russia exits the war, it becomes a more manageable war particularly on the Western Front, or so it seems. So the Germans can move divisions from the east to the west, and they feel that before the Americans arrive in very large numbers, the British and French armies are manageable. They can win this. They just have to, one more big push, and they will collapse because they're as exhausted as the Germans are at this point. Now, this turns out to be a miscalculation, as we all know, and the major spring and summer offensives of the Germans kind of collapse. They overstretch themselves and then end up losing the First World War. But the German generals, from relatively early on, sell the German population a very powerful myth, namely the idea that it's not them who are responsible for the defeat. It's actually those who are starting in early November 1918, starting a revolution in Germany. So they, according to their parlance, have stabbed the German army in the back. And this becomes such a powerful myth because even though it's not true, but it becomes a very powerful myth because we have to bear in mind that in November 1918, there's not a single Allied soldier on German soil, right?
yeah.
So they're still standing in France and they're still, defending the increasingly indefensible lines. Um, Still, Germany is going into the armistice negotiations quite optimistically because the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had repeatedly said that what he was hoping for was a peace without victors and a peace without defeated. So that essentially they would give back some of the land, they would probably have to pay some compensation, etc. But it would be a kind of conventional peace in, the spirit of, the Vienna Congress 100 years earlier,
Mm,
where France was actually asked to sit at the negotiation table. Um, and as it turns out, this is not the case, which in turn kind of provokes a very hostile response, particularly from the right in Germany,
mm,
essentially arguing that they had been tricked into signing a peace treaty, which they wouldn't have signed had they known what the terms and conditions might be, which includes
mm,
temporary annexation of the Ruhr and the Rhineland, particularly the Rhineland, as a sort of military buffer zone. It will eventually also include the cessation of territory, not just in the west, which Alsace and Lorraine, which was to be expected, but more critically in the east, where the new Polish nation state is emerging.
mm,
So there is quite a lot of resentment, also because, interestingly, because of the War Guild clause, which is symbolic in some ways. Germany is attributed full blame for the outbreak of the war. But the consequences of that is that the Allies stipulate that because Germany is responsible for the outbreak of the war, they have to pay reparations. And interestingly enough, the total amount of reparations is not fixed in Versailles, so it's potentially open-ended. Now, what I find is quite interesting is that the Allies don't put it in there because they know that whatever amount they would put in there would not be considered sufficient by their domestic populations. We have to bear in mind people in France and Britain have lost relatives, lots of them actually, in the war. There's still a very nationalistic mood that demands punishment of the defeated rather than a wise peace that would probably be a negotiated peace of one form or another.
mm,
Um, so there is quite a lot of disappointment, and ironically, of course, the people who are negotiating the armistice and then sign the Treaty of Versailles um, are members of democratic parties who basically assumed that, when Wilson said, well, I'm going to negotiate eye to eye, but only with people who have a democratic mandate, so not with the Kaiser, who had by this point fled into exile in the Netherlands. Um, they feel that Wilson is betraying the emerging German democracy by kind of imposing this seemingly impossible
mm.
peace on them.
And as well as you have in the treaty the disarmament of the German army, where you have a maximum have allowed to have 100,000 soldiers, you have the emergence of the far right groups known as the Freikorps as well, which I would believe established fairly quickly
Mhm.
after the treaty was signed. So let's talk about the emergence of the Freikorps in Germany as well.
Mhm. Yeah, so what happens in at the end of the war is that you still have millions of German men under arms, and they have to be demobilized. They have to be brought back to Germany proper, which is a process that is actually managed reasonably well. Um, but as certain parts of the revolutionary movement begin to radicalize, the Social Democrats become increasingly anxious, not least because they are looking to what's happening in Russia at the same time with the Bolshevik Revolution. Um, and they consider the so-called independent socialists, who subsequently become the Communist Party of Germany, um, as similarly dangerous as the Bolsheviks. So it's actually the Social Democrats and their Minister of Defense, Gustav Noske, who, together with regular troops, set up these so-called Freikorps, which are a combination of veterans of the First World War, but also younger, nationalistically minded students, for example, who missed out on the First World War experience, but are keen to fight communism wherever it might raise its head.
Mm. It's
Um,
it's interesting if I may. It's interesting that Hitler was actually one of those who remained in the army after the
mhm,
disarmament, even though he was almost on the line for subordination for avoiding the Austrian service. So he
mhm.
still were allowed to remain in the army and, of course, spy on what would later become the National Socialist Party.
Mhm.
Yes, so it's interesting that he was one of the few who actually remained in the army.
Yeah, I think the reason for that, so the army is obviously shrinking and being demobilized. But we have to bear in mind that Hitler at this point is still kind of unfinished in ideological terms. I mean, he
Mm.
knows that he
Obviously, yeah.
he wants to be a radical, but he doesn't know exactly whether he wants to be on the radical left or on the radical
Mm.
right. He's certainly a nationalist, but also finds certain elements of socialism quite appealing. Um, and his superiors in the army discover that he has a very strong rhetorical talent, so they use him as an instructor, and that's his main purpose in the remaining days of his military service. Then, in Bavaria, where he is at the time, he then pretty quickly realizes that he's of the political right and tries to find ways of a founding or rather joining and then turning into a party of his own, a
Mm.
political party, a political home, where he could transform Germany. But still, of course, for most of the 1920s, he remains a very obscure figure of the political right, who isn't supported by more than 2% of the electorate. At most. So his moment really comes a bit later, but it's interesting that, of course, the ideology of fascism in Italy, but also the ideology of Nazism in Germany is formed in this period immediately
Mm.
after the end of the First World War.
What was the purpose of the Freikorps? Was it just to cause trouble? Was it supposed to be an alternative to the army, considering, kind of a mercenary in a way? Or what were the purpose of the Freikorps in general? Was it, like I said, was it just an alternative to the army regarding the disarmament?
Yeah, the number of soldiers that Germany was allowed to have was capped as a result of the armistice and then the subsequent peace treaty. And therefore, setting up kind of these paramilitary organizations was a neat way of getting around that limitation.
Mm,
But also, because if you are not in the army, you're also not really bound by the conventions of a
mm,
military, right? So you can kind of circumvent that. They can behave in a way that would probably be deemed unacceptable for an officer. So, for example, they shoot captives, for example. So, in some ways, the idea is, Noske and to a certain extent Ebert think, okay, we're dealing with an unconventional revolutionary threat here, which demands unconventional methods. And they find a very receptive audience among those right-wing paramilitaries who are quite happy to be mobilized against real or perceived communists.
Hmm. So let's talk about the attempt of the German Communist Party as well to take over control in Germany, because like you said, that they were currently establishing. And is there any chance that they actually could have had been successfully taken over as the Communist Party, or was it just a slim chance in the get-go?
Um, well, the chances were always relatively slim for a number
Mm,
of reasons. First of all, because the state still had both the army and these paramilitary organizations at their disposal. Secondly, we have to bear in mind that the Social Democrats are actually the ruling party at the time,
mm,
um, who, of course, are the largest political party in Germany. They also command a lot of control over unions, for example. They're very organized locally. Um, so the situation is not quite comparable to that in Russia in the sense that you still have a functioning
mm,
state at the end of the war in Germany. You still have a functioning police system. You still have, as I said, the armed forces, and then in addition to that, the paramilitaries. So the odds were always against a far left takeover of power in a way that wasn't the case in Russia. Still, what is interesting is that Ebert is he's not just pretending that these people are a
mm,
threat. He has the case of Russia on his mind, where he saw very clearly that the Bolsheviks, although they didn't have a majority, only required a determined minority of professional revolutionaries to achieve their objective of overthrowing the government. So that's what he has in mind. And from his point of view, he is very anti-revolution. He's a social democratic, pro-reform, pro-evolution kind of guy, quite conservative in his sort of working class political objectives. And he doesn't want any major social revolution in Germany. There had been previously, already before the war, a kind of long-standing dispute between different factions within the Social Democratic Party, between those who were agitating for revolution and those who were increasingly arguing that the ambition of revolution should be replaced with a promise for social reform and evolutionary politics.
mm. But so what caused? How did they fail? How did the attempted revolution fail to
Well, I mean,
actually hold
it
power?
was always localized in the sense that there were sort of far left uprisings in Berlin, in Munich, where there was a temporary council's republic proclaimed, which was subsequently overthrown by Freikorps soldiers and regular troops. Um, and then there were subsequently various localized attempts at uprisings time and again. But they never had the manpower. So in some ways, the kind of the fantasy of Lenin as well, that Germany would be the next logical country
Yeah.
to fall. I mean, as a Marxist, of course, he had to believe that. He felt quite strongly that, the revolution was most certainly incomplete. If Germany was the next country, then there would be enough of a dynamic to trigger perhaps a global revolution, a world revolution.
It's interesting that it's almost the same exact thing happened in Romania, though they held power for a few days early more. And I believe there was an attempt in Hungary as well. I don't remember exactly, but it's several places that were attempted to take
Yeah.
over the communists, but all failed until the Second World War came and Stalin, of course, took over the Eastern Bloc. So it's interesting how all this communist revolution after the First World War would fail utterly, other than Russia.
Yeah, I mean Russia is the big exception, but there is relatively real fear in other countries that Bolshevism is going to spread westwards. I mean, you have the Finnish Civil War, as you
Mm,
say, you have the short-lived dictatorship of Benakun in Hungary. You have fairly sizable socialist movements. Some are not really communist, others are. Um, but there is kind of this perceived, even in the United States, there's this Red Scare, right? And in Britain as
Mm,
well, where people assume that, the communist revolution is only a matter of time. It will come, and we have to kind of crush it before it gets strong enough, the movement, to pose a serious threat to the state. And yeah, in some ways, the obviously in the interwar period, you have communist parties in virtually all European states, and they
mm,
are internationally coordinated by the Communist International, the Comintern in Moscow. Um, but as you say, they fail to seize power outside of Russia, and that only changes as a result of the Second World War,
mm,
the complete reshuffling of political
mm.
systems.
I
That
would say, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but one of the strongest, I would say, political parties outside Russia would be in Italy, especially in the aftermath of the Second World. I don't know much about the interwar year, but obviously Mussolini is the big, but after, especially after the Second World War, the biggest communist party I would say would be in Italy. In like
Mm.
from my
Yeah, no, I mean and I think that illustrates quite well what I was saying earlier on, because already during the interwar periods in the early 1920s, you have a sort of very strong Red Scare where, you've got lots of landless laborers, you've got lots of unemployed people, and Mussolini uses the perceived threat of
mm,
communism very skillfully to kind of persuade the conservative establishment that he is the only person with the necessary determination to make sure that communism will not get to the halls of power, that he will keep them out, that he has he also has the foot soldiers to make sure that communism will be defeated. So, and that's a dynamic you have all over Europe. You have it in Spain, which was not even a combatant in the First World War, but nonetheless, you have again this dynamic between landless laborers and owners of large latifundia in Spain, plus sort of class divides in the larger cities, um, and on both sides, they are kind of looking at what happens in Russia. They're also looking at what happens in other countries where communist movements are very violently suppressed. And that kind of, I think, determines much of the political dynamics in the 1920s and early 1930s.
So let's go to Russia then, and I want to start before, of course, before the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, because there were, as a matter of fact, two revolutions. For those who may not be familiar with the Russian Revolution, so let's start with the early one, the Kerensky Revolution, and the takeover and overthrow of the Tsar in early 1917.
Mhm. So yeah, you have, as you say, you've got two revolutions in Russia. One is creates a sort of short-lived democratic or near democratic state, replaces the Tsarist regime, and then subsequently the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, the main reason why revolution happens in Russia in the first place um, is the course of the war, during which many farm laborers, but also farm animals, were requisitioned for military service, uh, accelerating um, terrible conditions in terms of food provisions, so that you really genuinely have a sort of famine in Russia, which accelerates the disenchantment, shall we say, with the political regime, which in the eyes of many people had lost its legitimacy. Um, Now, interestingly enough, Kerensky decides to keep Russia in the war,
Mm.
and
Was there
therefore,
strong opposition at this time to keep Russia in the war, or
well,
they
there's,
were
there's
quite losing quite badly at this point? So were there oppositions at this point, or was there still strong encouragement to actually stay in the war? Because as you know, there it was quite there's a lot of disorder in the Russian troops with desertion and lack of ammunition, and it was on the brink of disaster, brink if not already a disaster on the Eastern Front, or I don't know if that would be the right term, but from the Russian point of view.
yeah,
But it was quite a disaster. So what were the strong opposition to stay out of the conflict, or
yeah.
what
I
were
mean,
the
there's
national feeling or the government feeling, if you will, because I doubt that the people had any say in this.
Yeah, I mean, there's pressure from both sides. I mean, there's pressure from the Russia's Western allies to stay in the war because they want to keep the pressure on Germany to fight
Mm.
a war on several fronts. And then there's pressure from the political left, not just the Bolsheviks, but also the socialist revolutionaries, um, to essentially take Russia out of the war. And in some ways, that's Lenin's most greatest promise, right? That actually
Mm.
increases their popularity is to say, I'm going to take Russia out of the war immediately. We want peace and we want bread, right? Two pretty basic things that appeal to a starving population that has suffered a great deal from the war and obviously lost people have lost relatives, etc., etc. So they just want the war to end, and that's a very powerful, simple slogan to capture the imagination of many people. And in truth, that's one of the very first things that Lenin does. I mean, he does it not just because he believes in peace, but he also realizes that um, the military situation at this point is so bad that if he doesn't conclude an armistice with Germany, German troops are very likely to be in St. Petersburg in 2 weeks' time. They can use the railway lines, and that would be the end of the revolution. Um,
But it's quite a humiliating treaty to make because it loses all of its
Absolutely.
former
Yeah.
empire, like Finland, and I don't remember if Ukraine was part of it, but they do lose quite a lot of their empire
Yeah.
from the Tsarist Russia. So let's talk about how humiliating the Brest-Litovsk Treaty
Yeah,
actually
no, the
were for
Brest-Litovsk
Russia.
treaties of all the treaties that were concluded towards the end of the war is probably the harshest in terms of yeah, as you say, Russia loses control virtually over its entire western borderlands, including the Baltic states, Ukraine. Finland had already declared its independence at the end of 1918. Um, so, but the Russians really have no choice. They try to kind of extend the negotiations that lead to the treaty in the hope that revolution will break out in Germany. That's kind of their hope. So they're
Mm.
trying to buy time until the German side says, well, we've negotiated enough. We can resume hostilities tomorrow. And then eventually they sign it. But I think it's it's tactical, and from Lenin's point of view, it's also without an alternative because this is already at a time when opposition against Bolshevik rule is
Mm.
increasing in Russia. So you can't win an international war and then a civil war at the same time.
Mm.
So it had to be one or the other, but with the idea, of course, that long term, and that's something that, has, I think, motivated Russian leaders from Stalin to Putin today to regain control over those
Mm.
Western lands.
Stalin kind of actually succeeded quite well in this after the famous, I just said before, the famous scene where Churchill just draw a line on a paper or something where that's Stalin's as
Yeah.
line as sphere of influence. So Stalin actually quite succeeded in creating the Russian or Soviet Empire, if you will.
Mhm.
But let's not thought that's all in the future. But, so let's stick to 1917. But because you don't have the Bolsheviks, of course, but you also have on the other side the Mensheviks, and let's talk about how the civil war occurred. Because from my understanding, Lenin wanted a civil war out of. So what was a gain for Lenin to have a civil war? And let's talk about the Russian civil war because that's one of the reasons why we discussed this episode is because that would last until 1921, and the British would help quite a lot until they finally gave up the support of the Mensheviks as well. They were supported both with troops and supply lines to the Mensheviks in the Russian Civil War. So let's talk about the how the Civil War would play out on the Russian side. And of course, the eventual what was Bolshevik victory inevitable. And I want to give a little bit, as there's a lot I'm saying right now, but we can also give a little bit background, I think, of the Menshevik Bolshevik conflict there that would lead up to the Russian Revolution. I know there's a lot to take in, but if you wouldn't mind.
Mhm. No, sure. Where to begin? So when we think about the Russian Civil War, we think of it as a conflict between reds and whites.
Mm.
But this kind of apparent clarity actually looks much more messy the closer you get to it, in the sense that what we usually label as the whites is a very, very wide coalition that could best be described as anti-Bolshevik, right?
And then we're
But
not saints either, to put it that way.
yeah, you basically, if you say the whites, you have groups ranging from Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, all the way to ex-Tsarist officers who basically want to restore the pre-revolutionary political regime. So
I wanted to call them royalists, but I was hesitant because no, it's I wasn't sure if that was the right term, but there's some
well, there
call
are
them
royalists.
royalists.
There are royalists. There are lots of ex-Tsarist officers, generals within that. It's a bit top-heavy, the movement, which is one of their problems going further down the line, because not really that many people want a restoration of the Tsarist regime in
Mm.
Russia, except for those who lived very privileged lives under that regime. So
Who
the
obviously had everything to lose by a Bolshevik
Exactly. So
revolution.
this conflict is in many ways, and I think that's perhaps a good way to describe it. It is existential in every possible way. From Lenin's point of view, civil war was always inevitable because he realized that in a class war, those who have something that they will lose will not give it up voluntarily, right?
Mm.
So they will
Hey, I
take,
wanted to become peasant too. Why
yeah,
not?
exactly. And in some ways, the greatest miscalculation that he made initially, he rectifies that further down the line, but was to, in addition to fighting the representatives of the old regime, also to take the war to the countryside, right? The so-called peasant wars are actually a conflict that Lenin loses because, you have a very broad definition of what constitutes a wealthy peasant. Um,
Or
so
kulaks, as they were called.
exactly, or kulaks, but that could be anything, someone who owns a little plot of land, right? So the image that one could use is, you have these Red Army emissaries going into the countryside to requisition grain. But if the peasant allows the grain to be requisitioned, he's going to starve to death, he and his family, right?
Mm.
So for them, it's an existential conflict, and they take up arms and they kill these emissaries whenever they meet them. And this becomes a very kind of, but from the Bolshevik point of view, it's also an existential threat because their strongest support is in the cities. But the cities require foodstuff to be delivered from the countryside or they will
Mm.
starve. So it's that sort of existential logic of the conflict that also gives it its extremely gruesome nature. It's a conflict in Russia loses more people in the Civil War than it does during the First World War. So I think that gives you a sense of the brutality of that
Mm.
conflict. But in addition to that political,
Especially by the Cossack brutality
yeah,
in this revolution.
yeah. I mean, in addition, the Cossacks are a very good example because in addition to these kind of class conflicts that play out, you also have a lot of nationalist independence movements that, can go either side. Either they believe Lenin in the sense that he says, "Well, I'm colorblind when it comes to your national or ethnic belonging, and I want to create a state for everyone in which everyone is equal."
Mm.
Or you say, this is a great moment actually to declare national independence. And that's what we're going to do. So you have that going on as well, particularly in the Caucasus, but also, in the area of the Don Cossacks. And then in addition to that, you have the mushrooming of local warlords, people who, in the absence of a state, essentially form criminal organizations, form their own criminal gangs, little bands of armed people who, so you have this bewildering complexity where red armies, white armies, green armies, and many others in between are fighting each other, and often in different constellations. So it's
Mm.
it's complex.
Mm. So, what causes the British? Let's talk. I want actually before that, I want to talk a little bit about British involvement as well in the Russian Civil War because they did support quite a lot of arms and troops, and this is
Hmm.
one of the reasons why why we are doing this episode to show that there weren't peace at all after the First World War. So let's talk about the British involvement in the Russian Civil War as well, and what made them lose kind of trust in the Menshevik side or
Hmm.
the white royalist side in this civil war.
But for Britain, there were two objectives. The first one was to keep Russia in the war, keep Russia fighting, and then subsequently, of course, in Winston Churchill's word, to strangle communism in its cradle, basically.
Mm,
Um, so those were the two main motivations. But it's worth, and you're absolutely right, of course, about the British Allied expedition into particularly Siberia. But what is often forgotten that lots of other states are involved there as well. The French are there,
mm.
particularly in Crimea. The Greeks sent troops, quite a lot of them actually. The Americans are there, the Japanese are there. So there's a lot of, you have this
Mm.
moment.
It's almost a mini World War One in its within
It
a
is.
civil war.
It is, and it's quite interesting. I'm very fascinated by the kind of future trajectory. I mean, obviously, the Allied intervention did not yield the desired result,
Mm. So
but
what
also,
caused it to fail then? Sorry for interrupting, but what caused the Allied intervention to fail, considering the main support were for the Menshevik and not the Bolsheviks? You would have think with these numbers that on the Allied side that they would be superior, but was it pure motivation, or what caused the Red Army to win the Menshevik army?
I think there were a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, Allied support was never really sufficient to control a vast territory like that of Russia. They were only kind of operating on the margins and trying to bulk up different armies. So one major problem of the whites was that they were never a unified movement and that they always had trouble. They had to kind of very often forcibly recruit their soldiers, who then in turn were deserting as quickly as possible. So in the Red Army, you have a higher level of ideological motivation. The Bolsheviks also, or the Red Army then, Trotsky's Red Army, has the advantage that they always hold the industrial centers connected by railways. So in some ways, they are much easier to defend than the
Yeah.
areas like Siberia, for example, or Ukraine. So it's first of all the fact that the whites are not a unified movement at all, and B, that in some ways the
Mm,
Bolsheviks always held the strategic advantage that would eventually then lead to the collapse, one
mm,
after the other, of the various white leaders. And General Wrangel was the last who then kind of withdraws to Crimea, but is then evacuated to
mm.
Constantinople, where the Allies control the city.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit before we go into Ireland. I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of the Menshevik losing, and of course the future of Soviet Russia. A little bit about the future. I mean, we know obviously if you read, but let's talk a little bit about consequences for the losing side of the Civil War.
Well, the immediate consequence was mass emigration from Russia. So, a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people who didn't see a future in that socialist state migrated. Some had to, others chose to do so voluntarily. So you have this kind of emergence of very large Russian exile communities in Western Europe, but also in parts of China. Um, and unsurprisingly, perhaps, these very large exile groups are deeply anti-Bolshevik.
Mm,
And they're quite an important transmission belt for anti-Bolshevik thinking. So take, for example, in Berlin in the early 1920s, you have dozens of Russian printing houses that are kind of, producing propaganda material against the Bolsheviks, but also have a direct impact in terms of what they say, what Soviet Russia is like, because there are relatively few Western observers there, um, in terms of how Russia is perceived in the West. Um, so that's one immediate consequence. The other, perhaps even more important, is of course that for the first time since the French Revolution, you have a revolutionary state in Europe, and the first sort of major European state that becomes communist, right? So,
Mm,
what that means is that, I mean, from kind of diplomacy point of view, of course, the Soviet Union is long ignored, except by some of the other defeated states of the First World War, like Germany. There's a lot of kind of mutual collaboration going on.
mm,
Um, but what it means is that the existence of a communist state with the infrastructure of the state either serves as a beacon of hope for people who want
mm,
a socialist revolution in their own countries. It's sort of, what they're looking for or looking towards for inspiration. And then on the other hand, you have people who are terrified. This is a living example of
mm.
what should not happen in their states, which I think in turn kind of,
I think Finland is one example
yeah.
here of.
Yeah, no, Finland is a good example. But generally speaking, of course, the Nazi Party and its successes after 1929
Mm,
is hard to imagine without, Nazi propaganda suggesting all the time that something that happened
mm,
in Russia could happen here in Germany any day.
mm.
That's a very powerful message in a time of economic crisis when the Communist Party in Germany is also growing. And
They were
where
quite strong in Germany pretty much up until 1933, weren't they?
they were, I mean, they were never as strong as the Nazi Party, but they were making increases in the elections. And for the German electorate, there was a perception, well, it's got to be a choice between one or the other. Which one are we going to vote for? Which, is not the only reason why Hitler wins, particularly in 1932, but it certainly didn't do any harm. When people say, well, the center is lost, we have to make a decision now.
Yeah.
Um, so that was certainly one of the kind of polarizing factors in it. And therefore, there is a kind of dialectic relationship between the Soviet Union and the rise of Nazism, which is difficult to deny. I don't think that, you know, just like Mussolini in Italy needed an enemy in order to convince people that, he was the one to defeat that enemy. The same is true for Hitler. And, Hitler had many enemies or perceived enemies or imagined enemies from communism to world Jewry. Of course, they
Mm.
are interconnected in his own image or in his own mind. And but yeah, those enemies are definitely needed for the mobilization of their own supporters.
Mm. So let's go to Ireland. You mentioned Ireland is in the start as well, and
Hmm.
that's of course that quite a forgotten conflict by many, of course, because Ireland were promised independence in 1920 after the First World War because their contribution with
Mhm.
Irish troops in the Great War. So let's talk about the independence and what would eventually lead to the split of both Northern Ireland and Ireland today, and what of course the Irish Civil War as well, and the creation of the IRA, eventually creation of the IRA.
Mhm. Yeah, the situation in Ireland is slightly different from that in Eastern Europe, but there are also some interesting parallels. So Ireland is the one Western European country where violence escalates quite quickly after the end of the First World War. So Ireland was obviously part of the of Great Britain up until until after the First World War, but as you say, had been promised home rule, whatever that means. Some degree of cultural and political autonomy within the empire um, as soon as the war would be over. Um, there were different things happened during the First World War. There was obviously the Easter Rising, which had initially been quite unpopular. It was only a handful of nationalists who decided to stage an uprising against the British. But it was the way in which the uprising was put down very brutally with gunboats on the Liffey River, but subsequently the leaders of the rising were executed. which kind of shifted public opinion more towards independence rather than just home rule. Um, so after the conclusion of hostilities in Europe, quite quickly the War of Independence breaks out, which is in some ways it's a guerrilla war between the British Army and various paramilitary groups that are used, the Black and Tans and others.
So
Um,
it's not just one unit fighting the British government. It's several.
Well, in Ireland, it's mainly the IRA at the time, which is very well organized and uses the landscape of Ireland to its advantage because what you have is you have different military installations in different parts of Ireland, but in between, it's quite hilly and ideal for ambushes. So you basically, it's very difficult. It becomes very costly. The British public was, war weary increasingly, and Britain also needed resources for its growing empire because it was growing, at least informally, through the League of Nations mandates in the Middle East. Um, so essentially, they wanted the problem to go away, and they offered the IRA a deal in the sense that they could have a treaty, the so-called Anglo-Irish Treaty, which would mean that essentially it's kind of home rule plus, so a free state would be created, but that would exclude the predominantly Protestant north of Ireland, and also Ireland would remain part of the empire. So, which means that governments would have to swear an oath of allegiance again
So what was the idea? Kind of the comparison, the idea that it would be like India, where they would have a kind of self-government of local Indians, but under British rule, was it same idea that would happen in later in India at that point?
Yeah, I mean, there are some parallels between India and Ireland, and the independence movements frequently exchange sort of ideas. Here,
I mean,
it's
what I mean is like in India, you had kind of a government of Indians, more or less answering to the British government. Was that the
yeah.
idea to
No,
implement
it
it?
would have gone beyond that. So Ireland, according to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which then is implemented, would have its own government, its own independent government. It's part of the empire. It's a bit like more like Canada, uh, the Canadian system. So there's full political, cultural, even military independence, but there are still bonds within that empire. Um, and then, but it's really kind of that Anglo-Irish Treaty and the limited sovereignty of the emerging free state that doesn't control all of Ireland that triggers the Irish Civil War because there are two different factions within the IRA. Some are hardliners. They say, Britain has to evacuate all of Ireland. We want independence for the entire island of Ireland. Um,
If I may, were the IRA kind of what we would call terrorists today, or as in the later years, such as in the time of trouble, or where there's just a more or less a paramilitary group like the Freikorps movement in Germany at this time?
Well, they're certainly paramilitary. Now, of course, it depends a little bit on your own kind of political inclination, whether you describe them as
They weren't the terrorists. They
freedom
would be
fighters
in
or
the
or
protests.
terrorists. The old kind of question. They are armed Republican. Interestingly enough, politically, actually, quite at least in the main, quite conservative. Um, National resistance, which had been strengthened by the fact that home rule was no longer enough for many Irish people at the time. But one of the sort of masterminds of the IRA, Michael Collins, was the man who negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and who was subsequently killed in an ambush by anti-treaty IRA men. So you have this sort of classic moment, which is actually quite typical, I would say, of this period, that the two sides who end up fighting each other in civil wars actually come from the same political background, right? These are, in the case of Ireland, they're all Irish Republicans, right?
Mm.
Who are united by the aim of creating some form of Irish statehood. In Germany, it's Social Democrats, and the communists are also former Social Democrats. In Russia, it's the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. So you know they are kind of fraternal enemies, and that very quickly leads to kind of armed escalation at a moment when the future seems to be wide open, right? It's wide open, uh, but there are disagreements about what the future state might look like.
Mm. So let's talk now. I want to talk more about Irish Civil War, of course, in the future, and we just want to talk a little bit about the more general views of it. And we'll definitely come back to the Irish Civil War in a future episode. But let's move to Anatolia, of course, because the Turkish are losing the war, and of course, I discussed with Eugene Rodian. They did try to fight fairly well for war in Anatolia, and they didn't lose until late 2017, early 2018. So they held on for quite a long time. But let's talk about the consequences in Anatolia and the Ottomans losing the Great War in the end, because of course the yeah, let's talk about the how the Ottomans were lost and the consequences there.
Yeah, I mean the Ottoman Empire, as you say, finds itself on the losing side in at the end of the First World War, and already in the final phase of the First World War, their empire, their very large empire, starts to disintegrate. Basically, they lose control over most of their Arab territories in what we now call the Middle East. Um, and there are all sorts of vested interests by different groups, be they Armenian, be they ethnically or religiously Greek Orthodox, all sorts of territorial designs on the Anatolian heartland of the Ottoman Empire. Um, and interestingly enough, the British government sort of encourages the Greek government under Venizelos because they want a strong partner and friend in the Mediterranean to take advantage of the temporary weakness of the Ottoman state to carve out a strong sphere of influence in Western Anatolia, which is an area where for hundreds of years, lots of Greek Orthodox people settled, lived as traders, Ottoman subjects. Um, and this is the area around Smyrna, which is then eventually uh, occupied by the Greeks. And against the Greek invasion, there is a growing national resistance, which is also against the Sultan, because he signed from their point of view, a treasonous peace treaty,
Mm,
the Treaty of Sèvres, and that's led by Ataturk, one of the
mm,
more famous officers, Ottoman officers of the First World War, and the future father of the Turkish Republic, of course. And the conflict is very prolonged and violent, but eventually leads to a disastrous military defeat for the Greeks. And what is worse, a major sort of exodus of Orthodox Christians from Anatolia and Balkan Muslims from particularly northern Greece. So there's this population exchange, which is involuntary. So if you are Christian, Greek Orthodox, you've got to go. If you're a Muslim living
mm.
in Greece,
Yeah.
you've got to leave. So a total of 1.2 million people crossed the Aegean as a result of it,
Mm.
completely transforming places like Athens, for example, which substantially increases in size. Um, and the impact, terrible as it is on Greece and on Turkey of that conflict, um, even goes beyond it because
It
it,
is war eventually, and the Ottomans are
yeah,
almost losing. There are Greek ships in the capital, and the conquest of the territory is, and I don't remember exactly how far, but the Greeks come quite far into Turkish territory until Ataturk finally hit back, until what we know is as Turkey today. So the area of Turkey could have looked quite different had the Greek won
Absolutely.
the war with Turkey and Greece. So let's talk about how the Greeks almost won and how they would end up in the situation that we have today and with the land area we have today between Turkey and Greece, of course. So let's start because there's quite a lot of history even just in this war.
Yeah, no, I mean some of the disputed territories actually go back to um, 1911, 1912,
Mm,
right? When uh, uh, some of the islands change hands and are then controlled by the Italians, who also have a vested interest in the region, of course, and want to become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Um, what what you described in terms of the Greek army getting very far is, of course, part of a very deliberate strategy employed by Ataturk. First of all, as soon as you get to the highlands
mm,
in Anatolia, supply lines much more difficult to maintain, which he knows. The
mm,
temperature changes quite considerably. It's boiling hot during the day and freezing cold at night. Um, and they move away further and further from the coast where they can be resupplied by ships. Um, the supply lines can be attacked by paramilitaries, which is exactly what happens. Um, and then eventually the front collapses. So, from the Greek point of view, the wiser thing to do would have been to establish a firm parameter around Smyrna, today's Izmir, where the actual population was concentrated, the Greek Orthodox population, and then to kind of establish um, a kind of mini imperial rule where Muslims would have been treated equally before the law as Orthodox Christians. But that was not the case, and there was a lot of violence against civilians in that conflict as well. So that kind of military overreach and overstretch was partly also the beginning of the undoing of the Greek army. And you have to bear in mind that maintaining an army over such a long period of time is also very costly. So the Greek state was essentially bankrupted over that military endeavor. And the hope, as in many wars, was the case with the First World War, the idea was that the war effort could be financed by sending the bill to the defeated at the end of it. So that was the logic, but of course that didn't happen. Um, but what I mean by saying that this terrible episode has ramifications that go beyond Turkey and Greece is that it shows that the collapse of the land empires, one of the solutions that Western politicians seem to find is to kind of unweave them ethnically. The idea that you separate people of different faiths, of different ethnic groups, in order to create a lasting peace, right?
yeah.
That's the idea. So this is a
But
very
if I may chime in, the British were technically still at war with the Ottomans. They didn't make peace at least until I don't remember forgive me, I don't remember if it was 1922 or 1923, but they were technically still at war with the Ottoman Turks or Turkey, if you will. So they
well.
were still at war in if you know in the physical they were technically still at war at least. A proxy war, if you will.
I mean, it is a proxy war, obviously, with the peace treaties that changes, and there's also an allied occupation of Constantinople,
Mm,
Istanbul, which goes actually far further beyond what is stipulated in the Versailles Treaty, for example. People always think about the Versailles Treaty as the prime example of a bad treaty. But in fact, all the other treaties that are concluded with Bulgaria, that are concluded with the Ottoman Empire, at least in 1920, um, go far beyond that. And in terms of attacks on sovereignty, for example, fiscal
mm,
control, etc. Um, and also kind of territorial consequences. But Turkey is interesting because as a result of the Greco Turkish War and the withdrawal of then British troop in the so-called Çanak crisis, um, means that Ataturk manages to turn a defeated state into a victor state of the First World War, certainly with the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. In some ways, as a Turkish nationalist, he has achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve. He wanted control over the Anatolian heartland. He wasn't actually interested in regaining territories in the Middle East. This was primarily
Mm.
about consolidating the Turkish Republic, which is what he achieved in that. And as such, he's extraordinarily important for both Mussolini and for Hitler because they look up to him as the one politician who managed to undo the Paris peace agreements. He's sort of the first of the revisionists, the first of the people, which is something that Hitler tries to do throughout the 1930s, all the way until the beginning of the Second World War.
Mm. So, but what I want to talk a little bit before we end this episode as well about the new colonial territories of both France and Britain, because of course, as the Ottoman Empire falls apart, and as you said in the beginning, this was supposed to be a war without territorial gain, but of course, that's not entirely true, is it? Because Britain would gain what they would call protectorate, but let's face it, let's call it what it is. It's colon. Let's call it rape and rape. It's the colonies of the British, such as Palestine for the British, and Algeria for the French. So let's talk about how they would divide and how the Middle East would change under British protectorate after the First World War, because wasn't entirely a war without territorial gain, because the British and the French gained quite a lot. Of course, the old German colonies in Africa as well were divided between the French and the British. So let's talk about the territorial gain that
Yeah.
came from the First World War.
Well, I mean, some historians have argued that the whole point of the Paris peace system, but also of the League of Nations by extension, was to kind of maintain and expand liberal empire, basically, as one of the main outcomes of the First World War, and that the prime beneficiaries, since the United States never became a signatory, since Wilson was no longer in office, um, that the key thing was the acquisition of these new territories, which were masked as League of Nations mandates in the Middle East in particular. Um, and that the reason for that was, on the one hand, economical. People were aware of oil and the existence of oil, but also strategic. Whoever controls, on the one hand, the access to the Suez Canal, on the other hand, to Gibraltar, effectively controls the Mediterranean, right, as
Yeah.
one of the major shipping routes to India. So there is a vital strategic and economic imperative, if you like, from the British point of view. Um, in terms of the outcome, this particular outcome of the First World War, as we all know, this was already agreed on, and part of the problem, something that haunts the Middle East to the present day, in fact, was that different promises were made during the war. So the Arab revolt was encouraged with the promise of some form of national independence. At the same time, a promise was famously made to the Zionist movement that a home for the Jews would be established in Palestine, which already during the 1920s caused all sorts of violent tensions there. Um, so you had a lot of broken promises. You had this impression, right or wrong, that Britain and
And
France
you
had.
wonder why they don't like like Europeans.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think from their point of view, it's entirely understandable, and also, and that adds another aspect to it is, of course, the abolishment of the caliphate, right?
Yeah.
So with the since
Yeah.
since the Sultan was no longer there was no one to kind of,
Because the caliphate was kind of a national unity among Arabs, right?
yeah,
That the Sultan was the great caliph of
yeah.
the Islamic world. That he, was the one they rallied around. Because there's always been a caliph since the dawn of Muhammad, or
Yeah.
after sorry, not since Muhammad, but after his death at least. There's always been a caliph. So there was, of course, like you said, it was what do we do now? Now that there is no more caliphs
Yeah,
around.
exactly. I mean, if you look at some of the key slogans of the Islamic State, for example. I mean, they are riffing on exactly those themes that,
Mm.
in the Middle East, you don't have to explain to anyone what was decided during that period. And so there is that association of the West with treason, broken promises, and so on and so forth. And the creation of very often artificial states, sometimes they followed the old administrative borders of the
Yeah.
Ottoman Empire, but in other cases, new states were created, client states that were obviously economically and politically dependent. So in some ways, yeah, here you could certainly say that what we're seeing today, both in Ukraine actually, and in the Middle East can be traced back a very long time. And in the case of Ukraine, people always talk about the Second World War, but I would say it all started with the first time that
Mm.
Ukraine became independent at the end of the First World War.
And I'm maybe derailing you a little bit now, but it's interesting you bring up Ukraine, and I kind of want to, and we're going to run up soon, but I want to mention, because the idea, one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 point was the idea of self-determination, and Ukraine was apparently not worthy of being self-determination. And there's the case with the Middle Eastern countries as well. Some countries do, for some reason, in the eyes of the Allies, deserved self-determination, but countries like Ukraine or the countries in the Middle East, for example, they were not worthy of. They needed a so-called protectorate of, other countries to rule over them. So the idea is, you see the hypocrisy in Woodrow Wilson, and I want to make an entire episode about this as well in the future, of course. But the hypocrisy of Wilson's 14 point, and especially ludicrous idea of self-determination, is very present there.
Yeah, it's actually very much in line with his political beliefs and indeed his racism. I mean, his
Mm.
self-determination was never universal, right? It was never intended
Yeah.
for colonized people, for example.
Mm.
And also, even within Europe, he had favorites, right?
Mm.
His favorite project was Czechoslovakia, then probably Poland. Those states were, in his view, oppressed states that had lived
Apparently,
in.
Ukraine wasn't.
Well, it didn't, in some ways, it depends on whether you have a good lobby master in DC or not. And the Czechs in particular were excellent at this. I mean, Masaryk was there, very
Yeah.
public figure. He probably didn't even represent the opinion of a majority of his people at the time,
Mm.
but he was very successful in kind of suggesting that the Habsburg monarchy was more oppressive than it actually was,
Mm.
perhaps.
It's interesting you bring this, and I'm sorry if I'm derailing again. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but it's interesting. I read The Red Prince by Timothy Snyder's a few years back, and they were talking about how the Habsburgs, wanted kind of a monarch in Ukraine, and Ukraine as an independent country. So
Mhm.
the Habsburgs, ironically, were more for Ukrainian independence than what the Allied were, apparently.
Yeah, there are sort of favorites in Paris. There's no doubt about it. And, in some cases, uh, it was already clear by the end of the war that they would be rewarded for whatever in terms of an independent state. Whereas, everyone petitioned um, Wilson. There were delegations from all over the globe trying to convince him that this, would be the way forward. And there was also subsequently a lot of disappointment when people realized that precisely, um, this universalist rhetoric, which wasn't intended to be universalist, was also seen as a kind of betrayal,
Yeah.
because people would have had independent notions of independence themselves, but they felt that there was a particular moment when those who are very powerful, perhaps then at the end of the First World War, the most powerful man in the world, the American president, would listen and perhaps agree. But everyone familiar with American politics, I mean, after all, Wilson is also the man who introduces racial segregation into federal offices in the
Mm.
United States. The man, it's very clear that he doesn't really care all that much about non-white people.
Mm. Also, another consequence of the First World War is that you see the fall of slow and decline of the British Empire as a superpower, and like you said, the emergence of America as being highly more influenced country in the global scale. So that's another consequence of the First World War is that larger than not the British diminished their influence because their reliance on the United States and their with the dollar and gaining, you know, I don't know the word, but the dollar becomes stronger and the British pound is weaker because the loan and the debts that the British owe the United States.
Yeah, no, no, that's another consequence. So, yeah, in some ways, some of the developments that we see today can still be kind of traced back. And I always find it interesting because people often say, well, in some ways, the Second World War is finished in a way that the First World War isn't. And
Mm,
I would actually agree with that to a certain extent.
mm. I think we're gonna conclude it there, and thank you so much for coming on the
Not
podcast.
at all.
But I want to ask you before you go one final question, I suppose. How would you conclude what we talked about today? And you kind of stated some of this in the beginning of the episode, but how would you conclude what people really think, and how people kind of changed their mind if they would listen to this episode that oh, maybe the First World War didn't really end in 1918. So how would you conclude our what we talked about, the subject we talked about today?
Well, I mean, I very much hope that the response is that people kind of start to be more open to the idea that, wars that we think we know very well um, might have different consequences in different parts of the world, and that in some ways, the narrative that we growing up in the West have become very accustomed to look
Mm,
very different if we adopt a
mm,
different perspective and kind of open up the perspective. And for a very long time, you know, not anymore, I would say, but for a very long time, Eastern Europe was kind of terra incognita.
yeah,
When people talked about the First World War, they primarily thought about, yeah, Britain, Germany, France, and
yeah.
maybe the United States in the end, but everyone else didn't really matter.
I know what we learned in school now is that the First World War ended in 1918, and then we were
Yeah,
peace, and all were lived happily ever after until at least 1933, and Second
yeah,
World War happened, and then
yeah.
the Cold War, and so on and so on.
Yeah. So, by questioning, I think those very neat, very Western oriented perspectives, I think we have a lot to gain in terms of our understanding that,
Mm,
wars have different consequences in different parts of the world, and some of those legacies are still with us today.
mm. Thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great
Not at
pleasure to
all.
have you on and
Thank you.
discuss this topic with you. And before you go, do you have anything you want to promote, any work you want to share, or names you want to share in the description? If people have any further questions about this topic, about why World War not necessarily ended in 1918, but lasted pretty much until the 1920s, where can people find you? Do you have any social media you want to share, or anything else you
Yeah,
want
I'm
to
quite
share?
easy to find, and if you are interested in, more advice on what could be read, please feel free to contact me, of course. And yeah, very happy to offer any further advice.
Thank you again. This has been a great question. My
Sure.
name is Alan. This has been about that age 12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars and also leave a comment. What are your thoughts on the misconception that World War One did not necessarily end in 1918? And of course, if you're on Apple Podcasts or you can leave a review. That would be very nice. I love reading your reviews of this podcast. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment what you think about what we discussed in this episode today. And of course, like, share, and subscribe. We are available on social media, on Twitter or X, whatever it is called today, on Instagram and Blue Sky, and all under that H12. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.